Okay, let's unpack this. You sent us quite a stack of sources here. Articles, reports from places like the Media Line, VOA, Zan Times, Dawat Media,
Mm-hmm.
all digging into a really critical and frankly challenging situation. What's happening with education and intellectual capital in Afghanistan right now.
That's right. And our job, really, in this deep dive, is to sift through all this material, pull out the key insights, and help you understand what these sources are actually reporting, what's supposedly going on, and why it matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump right in. The sources really start by laying out this core issue, what looks like a very systematic approach to fundamentally reshape Afghan education.
Yes, exactly. The sources we looked at describe a pretty deliberate effort, particularly hitting the universities hard.
Okay.
And the stated goals, at least as presented in these materials, seem to be, well, ideological. Some reports even mention things like ideological revenge.
Revenge.
Yeah, and what some analysts are bluntly calling the Talibanization of these academic institutions.
Wow. And the methods described sound quite intense. We're talking about active purges.
Purges of anyone seen as opposition, yeah. And a serious erosion of academic freedom, curriculum overhauls,
Right.
and basically forcing out academics, deans, anyone who dissents or just doesn't fit the mold.
Is there a specific example that stands out from the sources?
There is, yeah. The Media Line piece had a pretty compelling one. It detailed the dismissal of, I think it was 12 professors.
12?
Yeah, from Syed Jamaluddin Afghani University in Kunar province. And the reason given, they were accused of being Salafists.
Salafist. But what did that actually mean in this context, according to the source?
Well, it seems like a label used by the administration there to target people they saw as ideologically opposed or just too independent. You know, their supposed crime was pushing for academic freedom, resisting these new constraints. And it wasn't random. The sources mentioned it specifically hit professors from Sharia, agriculture, and education faculties.
So it sounds very targeted then. The reported motivation seems to be about silencing specific voices, particularly in this case male professors challenging the main ideological line.
Exactly. Push back against the changes, and you get labeled an ideological opponent. That's the pattern described.
And you mentioned something else interesting, the prioritization of clerics.
Right. One source really highlighted this trend, reporting that people with religious training, clerics basically, are being prioritized over academics with traditional qualifications for these university roles.
So what the sources are suggesting isn't just swapping personnel. It's more fundamental.
It seems so. It's about restructuring the entire education system, molding it to fit this very rigid set of beliefs. And some reports argue this process is actively dismantling the foundations of critical thinking, of intellectual diversity within these places.
Some academics in the material even called it educational demolition.
That's a strong term, yeah. Basically turning learning centers, which used to cover broad subjects, into something closer to seminaries.
Focused just on ideology.
Pretty much, yeah. Just propagating one specific ideology.
And is this new? Or does it have precedence according to the sources?
Well, the sources indicate this isn't entirely out of the blue. They point to past large-scale firings like 50 professors in Balkh province, maybe 300 in Herat.
Wow, 300.
Yeah. And they also note instances where professors who'd actually won scholarships to study abroad were replaced by individuals apparently linked to the administration.
So it suggests this pattern, prioritizing loyalty or, ideological alignment over academic merit.
Mm-hmm.
It's been happening for a bit.
That's the picture painted in the sources, yes.
Okay, so that covers the universities, the professors,
Yeah.
the systematic changes. But the effort to control knowledge, it doesn't stop there, does it?
Yeah.
The sources also talk a lot about who even gets access to education.
Absolutely. Which brings us straight to the widely reported exclusion of women from education. This has been a huge policy shift.
Starting with secondary schools.
Right. Secondary schools, then universities for girls. And more recently, as the sources note, a decree came out banning women even from medical and paramedical institutions.
So closing off basically one of the last pathways for women in higher education.
Effectively, yes. One of the last significant routes for professional training for women.
Did the sources offer any official justification for this?
One source did mention an official line, yeah. Something about previous governments giving women too much freedom, which allegedly led to social and immoral problems.
Okay.
And this exclusion, it kind of ties into this broader trend the sources describe as mulacracy.
Mulacracy.
Yeah, it's this idea that graduates from madrasas, religious schools, are reportedly being prioritized for key roles across the board, not just in education, over people with traditional academic qualifications.
And how widespread is this, according to the reports?
Pretty pervasive, it seems. The sources report that key specialized government jobs, think politics, law, economics, diplomacy, trade, even engineering, procurement, environment.
Really? Engineering, too.
That's what's reported. That these roles are being filled, sometimes even monopolized, by individuals who aren't professionals in those areas, but are, mullahs, malvis, caliphs, different titles for clerics.
Is there an example of that?
Yeah, one source shared a telling anecdote. It was about the acting minister of telecommunications, described as a malvi, a cleric, attending a conference full of actual telecommunication experts. And the source sort of pointedly asks, what's this cleric's background in informatics technology? It highlights that perceived gap.
Right, the disconnect between the role and the stated qualifications.
Exactly.
The materials also mention how the Constitution is viewed and curriculum changes.
Yeah, some reports mention the Constitution being called a devil's booklet in some circles. And there's this ongoing massive revision of curricula everywhere to align strictly with one interpretation of Islamic Sharia.
Although, we should note, one official source did maintain that Islam isn't against modern education.
That's true, yeah. That source stated the curriculum revision is specifically for aligning Islamic principles with modern learning. So there's that counter perspective presented.
But in this environment, where traditional qualifications seem less valued, there was that other striking statement one source mentioned about qualifications being linked to something else entirely.
Yes, that was quite extreme. One source referenced a statement reportedly made that implied academic qualifications might somehow be judged by the number of mine-laying operations someone conducted.
Seriously?
Yeah, presented as an extreme illustration of how merit might be viewed differently now.
And the consequence of all this shift,
Yeah.
what does it mean for professional education centers?
Well, the sources report they're losing their relevance. I mean, why spend years studying engineering or law if there's no guarantee you'll get a job in that field?
If graduates from religious schools are favored instead.
Exactly. One source argues this effectively turns Islam into a tool to suppress modern life, modern legal frameworks, creating a system where religious background, not expertise, dictates opportunity.
Okay, so these huge changes within education, the shift in who holds professional jobs, it logically leads to something else the sources document extensively, people leaving. The brain drain.
Right. The accelerated departure of skilled people. Now, Afghanistan's had brain drain before, a long history of it, but the sources are pretty clear that this current wave, especially since the 2021 takeover, is, significant and ongoing.
And who is reportedly leaving?
It's a wide range. Journalists, poets, writers, professors, students, professionals from just about every field you can think of, often described in the sources as, Afghanistan's finest brains.
And what's pushing them out, according to the analysis?
It's a mix of things. The push factors inside Afghanistan are strong governments described as elite repelling, fragile systems, tribal issues, political instability, conflict.
And crucially, that exclusion of educated people we just talked about.
Absolutely. That's a major factor highlighted. Then there's this idea of relative deprivation.
Meaning?
Just the feeling that you can't achieve your potential, you can't reach valuable goals within the country anymore.
Right. And then the pull factors from outside.
Of course. The lure of the West, perceived freedom, equality, just modern life opportunities. Plus, the sources mention existing Afghan diaspora networks helping facilitate migration for those who can manage to leave.
Now, the analysts in these sources say this current brain drain is different, maybe more damaging than before. Why is that?
What's really concerning, highlighted in the analysis, is the perception that it's not just some people leaving, but that a majority of the skilled and intellectual class actively want to get out.
A majority?
Yeah. And if that's the case...
It means you're not just losing the current talent pool.
Exactly. You might be losing the very capacity to train the next generation because the potential teachers, the mentors, they're leaving too, or they're being sidelined.
That's sobering, and the consequences described, they sound severe.
They are. The sources list quite a few. There's the immediate economic cost, obviously. All that investment in educating people, just wasted.
But it goes much deeper.
Oh, yeah. It weakens the country's whole scientific and specialized base. It cripples innovation, R&D in vital areas like education itself, health, technology.
Which holds back development?
Identified as a primary cause of underdevelopment, actually, and it creates huge problems in management and administration.
Because unqualified people are in charge, as reported.
Leading to dysfunction, inefficiency, wasted resources, just a mess, basically.
And the broader societal impact.
The sources suggest it leads towards stagnation, a society lacking knowledge, lacking a broader worldview. It fosters what sociologists call enemy.
The breakdown of values.
Yeah, a breakdown of norms, values, deepens despair, reduces hope for the future.
And there was a link mentioned to extremism, too.
A very worrying one. This environment, lack of opportunity for the educated, dismantling institutions, it apparently becomes fertile ground for fostering and growth of extremism and terrorism.
Leaving the next generation vulnerable.
Potentially more susceptible to radical ideas, yeah, maybe due to fewer alternative paths or less access to critical thinking skills.
There was that powerful quote trying to sum it all up.
Ah, yes. From an analyst in one source. It really hits hard, characterizing it as the brain drain of recognition and tolerance, the brain drain of knowledge and progress, the brain drain of wisdom and understanding.
And ultimately,
the brain drain of the 21st century from Afghanistan captures the scale of the perceived loss.
Though, just for balance, you mentioned one official source had a counterclaim.
Right, yeah. It's worth noting, an official source included in the materials did state that the administration is apparently working on some kind of plan to try and bring back senior professors who left previously.
Okay. So, taking all this in, what does it really mean? This deep dive into the sources you provided paints a really complex and honestly quite concerning picture. We've heard these reports of a systematic effort to reshape education purges, restructuring, but also official claims about aligning education with Islamic principles and modern learning.
A contradiction there, or at least a tension.
And there's the exclusion of women, this rise of malocracy in professional roles, and the devastating consequences the sources lay out for this brain drain.
Yeah, from economic loss and hindering development to, well, fostering inefficiency, despair, even extremism.
It really shows a society grappling with potentially losing its educated class while its learning institutions are being fundamentally changed.
It's a profound shift described in these materials.
Which leaves a big question, really, for you, the listener, to think about. What is the long-term future, maybe generations down the line, for any society when its knowledge infrastructure is reshaped so dramatically and so many of its brightest minds feel they have no choice but to leave?